The sun had long sunk behind the jagged peaks of the desert, leaving the canyon rim bathed in a pale silver glow. The wind whispered through the scrub, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant smoke, a reminder of the scattered fires of travelers and hunters alike. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, soft strains of a flute drifted from the shadows of a weathered cliff, playing a melody that seemed older than time itself. It was a song of caution, of longing, and of the kind of longing that comes from living close to the earth, its unyielding truths. In the heart of this quiet wilderness, a figure moved with a precision born of countless seasons. He was an Apache warrior, tall and lean, his face marked by the dust of many trails and the faint scar of battles fought in silence. He carried himself with the calm authority of someone who knew the law of the land better than the words of men. For years, he had walked a path of honor and restraint, following the rules he had set for himself, a life measured in patience, in observing rather than acting rashly. He was a man who could read the shifting patterns of the wind, who knew where water hid beneath the earth, and who had learned to carry both danger and restraint in equal measure. Tonight, though, the wind seemed different. It carried with it a tension that prickled at his senses, a warning that the night would not unfold as others had. Somewhere nearby, a faint light glimmered, a lantern held by a woman who had wandered far from the safety of her home. Her presence startled him not because she was lost, but because she moved with a courage that was rare and undeniable. He had observed many who entered the desert unprepared, but she carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone determined to face what lay ahead. Whatever that might be, she was young, with hair that caught the last light of the setting sun and eyes that seemed to hold both fear and defiance. Her lips trembled slightly as she whispered words that were almost lost in the wind. "Please, be gentle." Those words reached him like a call across time, stirring something deep within the warrior. They were not words of surrender, nor of weakness, but of trust and hope. Fragile, yet unwavering. The Apache paused, listening. His life had been shaped by boundaries lines drawn in the sand, rules etched into his heart. Yet her voice, so delicate and earnest, seemed to challenge those rules. It was not an invitation to abandon restraint recklessly. It was a plea for understanding, for connection, for the acknowledgement that even those who had hardened themselves against the world could be touched by its softer, human side. He moved closer, the sound of his footsteps masked by the natural rhythm of the desert night. Every step was careful, deliberate, a dance of respect and caution. He had faced danger many times, hostile tribes, treacherous terrain, wild animals, but never had he confronted a situation that demanded this kind of balance, where the stakes were not just life or death, but the fragile trust of another soul. The maiden stepped from behind the lantern's glow, her figure outlined against the silvered sand and shadowed rocks. She held herself with a poise that betrayed the uncertainty she must have felt, a posture that whispered she was not naive but aware of the power that stood in the darkness before her. She did not flee, did not cry out, met his gaze with a strength that made the air between them electric. He remembered the rules he had lived by. Never act out of impulse. Never let desire cloud judgment. Never allow your heart to make decisions your mind would regret. And yet something in her eyes, in the soft pleading of her voice, made those rules tremble. She asked for gentleness, yes, but more than that. She asked for recognition, for a breaking of barriers that he had built so carefully around himself. For hours, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind ceased its wandering across the cliffs. The night became still, and the world itself seemed to watch as the two figures faced one another. In that silence, he could hear the beat of his own heart, the rhythm of a life that had always been measured by caution, and the quiet insistence of a soul awakening to a new kind of challenge. The warrior knelt beside the fire she had managed to build, the flames casting flickering shadows across his face. He examined the rough hands of the woman, noticing the calluses from hard work, the careful care she took in holding herself upright despite fear. It spoke of a life not entirely protected, not entirely safe, but full of courage. And courage, he realized, demanded a response that rules alone could not provide. She looked up at him, her eyes searching for an answer that he had not yet formulated. I need to know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, that you will not hurt me. The plea was simple, human, and yet it carried the weight of countless unspoken dangers. He felt the old tension within him, the balance of instinct and principle, of honor and desire. He had always been a man who measured each choice, who weighed every action against the potential consequences. But tonight, the rules he had lived by seemed inadequate to meet the depth of what was unfolding. Her presence demanded not a measured response, but a recognition of trust, a willingness to navigate something new, something uncertain. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched the firelight dance across her face, noting the shadows that deepened the intensity of her expression. She was not asking for control. She was offering trust, a gift far more dangerous than any weapon he had ever faced. And the thought of mishandling it, of breaking that fragile bond, was more frightening than any enemy he had ever confronted. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly around them. Yet the world had shrunk to this small circle of firelight and silent understanding. Every rustle of wind, every distant cry of a night bird, every flicker of shadow became part of the moment. Part of a decision that would test the very rules he had lived by. The night held its breath with them, waiting, watching. As he wrestled with the choice before him, she stepped closer, her hands trembling only slightly, and the words escaped her lips again. Please, be gentle. Not a demand, not a challenge, but a fragile offering of trust. The warrior knew that responding to it meant crossing into uncharted territory, breaking rules he had never broken. Venturing into a part of himself he had long kept hidden. The canyon walls echoed with the silence that followed, a silence thick with possibility and tension. The firelight flickered, casting shapes that seemed almost alive, shadows of a story that was only just beginning. And in that silence, he made a choice, not yet a declaration, not yet an action, but a readiness to engage with a world he had always observed from a distance. He leaned closer, the air between them charged with anticipation. The night held a secret, and the secret was theirs alone. A promise of something beyond the ordinary, a night that would challenge the boundaries of trust and courage. The wind stirred once more, carrying the scent of sage and the distant river, reminding them that the world beyond the canyon still existed. But for this moment, all that mattered was the fragile human connection forming in the silvered night. And then, without warning, a sound shattered the fragile peace, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of a coyote. The unmistakable reminder that the world beyond their circle of trust was real, immediate, and ever watchful. The Apache's gaze hardened, the warrior's instincts returning in full force. Yet even in that instant, he knew something had shifted. The rules he had followed for so long would be tested, perhaps even broken, because some things, some trusts, some moments demanded courage beyond the ordinary. The maiden looked up at him again, her eyes wide, her breath caught between hope and fear. "Are you going too?" she began, and then paused, as if words themselves were too fragile to carry the weight of what was coming. The warrior did not answer, not yet. His hand hovered near hers, not to claim, not to command, but to honor, to acknowledge the trust she had placed in him. The night waited. The canyon waited. And somewhere deep in the shadows, destiny itself seemed to hold its breath. As the Apache prepared to face a choice that would change not just the course of this night, but perhaps the course of his life, in the darkness, only one thing was certain. The rules had been challenged, the ordinary had been left behind. And the story of that night, the story of trust, courage, and the uncharted territory of the human heart was only just beginning. The night air had grown cooler, and the canyon seemed to close in around them, wrapping the two figures in a cocoon of shadow and silver light. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward like tiny stars trying to escape the darkness. The Apache warrior remained still, his eyes scanning the edges of the clearing, alert to every whisper of movement, every subtle shift in the wind. The desert was alive with secrets tonight, and he knew better than anyone that danger could appear where one least expected it. The maiden shivered slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. She had come here for reasons she could barely speak aloud. driven by curiosity, courage, and perhaps something she did not yet understand about herself. Life in her village had always been measured orderly and confined by rules she had learned to follow without question. But the desert, the endless expanse of sand and stone, the shadows of cliffs and mesas offered a freedom she had never known, and with it, the kind of fear and excitement that made her heart race. She had heard the stories of the Apache warrior before she ever laid eyes on him. Tales whispered in the evenings by travelers and traders. Stories of a man who moved like the wind, who was as fierce as he was wise, who followed a code that made him untouchable in the eyes of those who knew him only from afar. Yet these stories had painted him as distant, almost untouchable, a figure of myth as much as of flesh and blood. Standing here, she realized how little she truly understood him, and how much of his presence demanded respect, caution, and an awareness she had not expected to feel so intensely. He did not speak, but his silence was not empty. It carried a weight of experience, of battles fought and survived, of choices made in solitude and reflection. His eyes, dark and watchful, held the kind of focus that could pierce through lies. Through illusions, through the superficial layers people often presented to the world, he seemed to see her, not just her body or her actions, but the very currents of thought and emotion beneath, and that awareness made her both nervous and oddly comforted. For the warrior, the night brought memories he rarely revisited. He had grown up in a world that demanded both vigilance and restraint, learning early the delicate balance between survival and honor. His people had taught him to read the signs of the land, to respect its rhythms, and to act only when necessary. Violence was not something he sought, but it had been a companion on many trails, a shadow that followed him even when he hoped for peace. Yet this night was different. The presence of the maiden, her unspoken trust and gentle plea, stirred something in him he had long kept. It buried something neither rules nor discipline could contain entirely. She sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around her knees, her gaze shifting between the flames and the darkened cliffs beyond. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to make sense of the quiet tension that hung between them, but the words seemed inadequate. Instead, she listened to the wind, to the fire, to the subtle movements of the warrior beside her. Every glance he offered, every careful gesture, told her more than speech could. She realized that understanding him would require patience, observation, and a willingness to step beyond the boundaries of her familiar life. The desert around them seemed to hold its own stories, waiting to be discovered. The rocks bore the scars of centuries, weathered and etched with patterns that hinted at past storms and long-forgotten journeys. The wind carried whispers of travelers long gone, of secrets buried beneath the sand, and of dangers that could emerge without warning. Both the warrior and the maiden were acutely aware that the stillness was fragile, that any misstep could shift the balance, and that their own choices tonight would ripple far beyond the small circle of foliage. She thought of her village, of the life she had known before this night. It had been a life of safety and predictability. It had also been constrained by expectations and limits she had accepted without question. The desert offered no such guarantees. Here, survival was measured not by obedience, but by awareness. Not by comfort, but by courage. She had chosen to step into this unknown, to face the fear and the wonder of it. And now, in the presence of the Apache, she realized that her choices carried consequences far beyond her imagination. The warrior's eyes lingered on her, noticing details that might seem trivial to others but spoke volumes to someone who had spent years tuned to every nuance of the human presence. The way she breathed, how her shoulders tensed and relaxed, how her eyes flickered with light and shadow, all of it told him she was both wary and willing, both cautious and brave. He felt the pull of responsibility, the weight of trust she had placed in him simply by being here. And he knew that crossing certain lines would not be about desire, but about honor, about respecting a bond that had been offered without guarantee. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The fire burned low, its warmth comforting against the chill of the night. Somewhere in the distance, the faint howl of a coyote echoed, a reminder that the wilderness, was never truly silent, that the desert always had a voice and a watchful eye. The warrior and the maiden remained in the circle of firelight, a fragile island of calm amid the restless night, each aware that the moment they shared was suspended between the known and the unknown, between safety and risk, between rules and something entirely new. She spoke again, softly, carefully, as if testing the boundaries of the silence. "Have you always lived like this?" Her voice carried curiosity and a hint of reverence. A question about the life he had led, the path he had chosen, and the rules he had followed. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the fire speak for a moment, its crackling filling the spaces between them. Finally he spoke, his voice low, steady, and deliberate. "I have learned to survive," he said, "to move with the land, to respect what is, and to guard against what could be. But survival is not only about strength. It is about knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to trust what is offered to you." She nodded slowly, trying to understand not just his words, but the depth behind them. She could feel the weight of his experiences pressing gently, like the pull of the earth beneath her feet. The desert, the fire, the night all seemed to conspire to teach her lessons she had never anticipated. Lessons about courage, patience, and the quiet power of restraint. Yet, even as they shared this fragile understanding, neither could ignore the tension in the air. There was a presence in the darkness, subtle but undeniable. Something or someone watched from the edges of the canyon, hidden in shadow yet close enough to disturb the stillness. The warrior's hand brushed near his bow, a silent gesture of readiness. The maiden instinctively pressed closer to the fire, her eyes darting toward the shadows. Both knew that the desert had no mercy for the unprepared, that danger could arrive without warning, and that their moment of fragile trust might be tested at any second. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of distant smoke and the faint metallic temps of danger. The warrior's eyes narrowed, scanning the cliffs, the scrub, the shifting shadows. He had survived ambushes, storms, and conflicts that could have ended him countless times. Yet tonight, the uncertainty was different. It was not merely the presence of an unseen threat, but the interplay of trust and risk, of human connection and the uncharted territories of emotion. The maiden could feel his tension, could sense the careful calculations behind his calm exterior. And though fear lingered, there was also a growing sense of connection, an understanding that their fates were intertwined for the moment, that the night demanded a vigilance they could only achieve together. She had come seeking adventure, perhaps even understanding, and now she realized that it was the warrior's presence that both challenged and protected her, that forced her to confront the unknown and to measure her courage against the harshness of the desert. Hours stretched into the deep night. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, yet the tension between them remained, as palpable and unyielding as the cliffs around them. They had shared no grand declarations, no promises, yet a subtle bond had begun to form, one based on respect, courage, and the fragile offering of trust. And still, the unknown lingered at the edges of perception. The presence in the shadows, the restless wind, and the vast, uncharted desert reminding them that their story had only begun. Neither spoke much after that, each lost in thought, each aware that the night was far from over. The warrior knew the rules he had lived by were under quiet assault, challenged not by force but by human connection, by the gentle plea of a maiden who had come seeking more than mere survival. The maiden, for her part, felt the thrill and the fear of being close to someone who carried the wilderness in his very being, someone whose silence was as potent as any word, whose restraint held a depth she was only beginning to fathom. And so, the night stretched onward, a canvas of silver light and shadow, of unspoken thoughts and quiet anticipation. Every rustle, every flicker, every distant sound carried weight. Each moment, a delicate balance between discovery and danger. The desert waited. The fire waited. The canyon itself seemed to hold its breath. And in the stillness, the Apache and the maiden remained, poised at the threshold of decisions that would shape not only the night, but perhaps the paths their lives would take long after the fire had burned to ashes. The dawn had not yet broken. But the desert stirred with the subtle sounds of early movement. Somewhere far off, the faint cry of a hawk cut through the stillness, and the shifting wind carried with it a dry, sharp scent that hinted at rain in the distant mountains. The Apache warrior remained close to the fire's fading embers, his senses alert to every rustle in the brush, every shadow cast by the rising sun. His instincts had never failed him, and yet tonight, the balance he relied on seemed fragile, as though the world itself held its breath. Waiting to see what would unfold, the maiden shifted beside him, her gaze sweeping the horizon with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She had slept little, her thoughts tangled between fear and fascination, wondering at the man beside her and the wilderness that surrounded them. She had never known life to feel so immediate, so raw, so heavy with possibility. In her village, the days had moved with the predictability of the seasons, marked by routine and the measured rhythm of chores and expectations. Here, the desert ignored such routines, demanding attention, courage, and the willingness to face the unknown. The warrior's eyes narrowed as he spotted a distant shimmer among the rocks, a subtle movement that suggested they were not alone. He did not speak immediately, instead motioning for her to remain quiet. The shadows could conceal both friend and foe, and he knew better than to assume the nature of what they faced. His life had been shaped by encounters like this, where patience and awareness determined whether one survived or vanished into the unforgiving land. She followed his gaze, sensing the tension that ran through his body. Are they coming for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words carried more than fear, they carried recognition of the danger that hovered in the periphery, the understanding that the night had offered only a fragile sense of safety. He did not answer with words. Instead, he reached for his bow, the movement smooth and deliberate. It's a natural extension of himself rather than an act of preparation. His hands had known danger countless times, had drawn weapons in defense and in honor, and yet this moment was different. It was not only the threat beyond the firelight that demanded his attention, but also the complexity of the trust that had formed between him and the maiden. Any misstep could disrupt that delicate balance, could turn courage into fear, and trust into regret. The desert seemed to press in closer, the cliffs rising like silent sentinels, the sand beneath them a shifting sea of uncertainty. The warrior's mind moved in patterns honed by years of survival, assessing possibilities, anticipating actions, weighing risk. He recognized that the shadows beyond the immediate circle of firelight could conceal hostile travelers, predators, or worse, unknown dangers of the land itself. Yet, as he calculated, his thoughts kept returning to the maiden. Her presence had altered the night, reshaping the rules he had followed for so long, demanding vigilance not only for survival but for something far subtler, far more human. She watched him, trying to read the tension in his posture, the flicker of his expression, the way he held himself on the knife edge of alertness. She sensed his respect for the land and for her, and it gave her courage even as fear pressed at the edges of her resolve. Her hands rested lightly on the fire-warmed stones, grounding her, reminding her that she too had agency, that she was not merely a witness to the warrior's vigilance, but a participant in the unfolding story of the night. The wind shifted again, and with it came faint traces of something unusual. Smoke, carried from an unseen fire far beyond the canyon, mingled with the scent of sage and dry earth. The warrior's nostrils flared as he inhaled, the memory of past conflicts sharpening his focus. Smoke could mean travelers, traders, or danger. Ambushes were not uncommon in these parts, and even the most careful navigation of the desert could bring one into contact with hostile parties. He made no move to rise, but his body tensed, a subtle signal of readiness, a quiet warning that the desert never slept, and neither could he. The maiden sensed the shift, her pulse quickening. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand what he perceived, but she hesitated, knowing the slightest sound might betray their position. She felt the weight of the canyon around her, the vast openness above and the enclosing cliffs at her back, and realized how small and fragile her existence was in this untamed expanse. And yet, within that fragility, There was an unexpected strength of clarity, born of facing something far larger than oneself. A confrontation with the rawness of life and survival. He glanced at her, noting the mixture of fear and determination in her expression. It reminded him of his own beginnings, of days spent learning to navigate the desert, to move silently, to respect both its beauty and its danger. He had lived by rules that kept him safe, rules that shaped his choices. Yet she had brought a new variable into his life, a human element that no calculation could fully encompass. He could anticipate threats. He could read the land. But trust, vulnerability, courage, those were matters of the heart. And they demanded attention beyond logic. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the rocks to the north, followed by a barely audible whisper, as though someone or something was testing the edges of their circle of safety. The warrior's hand tightened around the bow. The maiden instinctively pressed closer to the firelight, feeling its warmth and its illusion of security. They were not yet discovered, but the tension of the moment was undeniable. A knife edge between safety and exposure, between quiet and chaos. Hours seemed to pass in suspended time. The desert's stillness became oppressive, each sound magnified, each movement significant. The warrior considered the possibilities, scanning not just the immediate threat but the larger context. The canyon could hide enemies, travelers, or bandits who preyed on the unwary. The maiden's presence complicated matters, introducing vulnerabilities he had not encountered in his years of solitude. He had to protect her, yes, but he also had to respect her autonomy, her courage. Her choice as a task that required more than skill with a weapon. It demanded judgment, patience, and an understanding that some dangers could not be faced with force alone. She watched him, her own mind racing with questions she dared not voice. Who was he really, beyond the myths and the stories? What had shaped his code, his silence, his restraint? And perhaps more pressing, what did this night mean for her? For the choices she had made, for the trust she had extended simply by remaining here. The canyon seemed to demand answers that were not ready to be given. And the desert itself seemed to whisper that clarity would come only in its own time, and not on her terms. The warrior finally broke the silence, his voice low, deliberate. Carrying the weight of experience and the subtle tension of uncertainty, "There are paths we cannot predict," he said, "and dangers that do not announce themselves. The desert has its rules, and so does life. One misstep can change everything. But trust can guide us if we are careful." She nodded, absorbing his words, understanding that survival was not merely a matter of physical endurance but of judgment, perception, and the subtle balance of human connection. She realized that her own courage had been tested not by the land alone, but by her willingness to engage with someone who embodied both danger and protection, someone whose life was shaped by rules she was only beginning to comprehend. The wind rose, carrying a harsher scent of smoke and dust, signaling that the unseen presence was drawing nearer, testing their vigilance. The warrior rose to his feet slowly, deliberately, eyes scanning the horizon. The maiden did not flinch. She stood beside him, her body tense but her mind alert, ready to face whatever might come, knowing that their fates were intertwined for this night at least, somewhere in the canyon. Shadows shifted, forming shapes that were difficult to interpret. The warrior's instincts sharpened, every muscle coiled for action. The maiden's own courage matched the tension. Her presence a reminder that trust and vigilance must coexist, that human connection could be both a strength and a liability in the face of the unknown. They remained like that, suspended in the quiet before the storm, aware of each other, aware of the desert, aware of the presence that lurked just beyond the circle of firelight. The canyon held its breath, the night stretched on, and the story of trust, courage, and the fragile balance of life in the wild continued. Unresolved and electric, ready to move into the next moment of discovery, risk, and uncharted emotion. The first streaks of dawn had begun to pale the edges of the canyon, washing the rocks in a faint, cold light that made every shadow sharper, every movement more pronounced. The desert was waking slowly, but the silence remained heavy, almost oppressive. as if the land itself sensed that something was about to happen. The Apache warrior crouched near the fire, now little more than glowing embers, his eyes scanning the edges of the cliffs, the scrub, the shifting light. Every instinct, honed by years of survival, screamed that the night's fragile peace was about to end. The maiden shifted beside him, her breath shallow, her senses alert. Sleep had eluded her, replaced by a strange combination of fear and anticipation that tightened her chest. She had learned, in these hours, that the desert was not merely a place, but a living force, one that demanded respect, patience, and vigilance. And she realized now that the warrior beside her was not simply a protector, but a living embodiment of that force, his strength and restraint shaping the very rhythm of the canyon around them. A flicker of movement caught her eye, something distant, barely discernible against the cliffs. Her pulse quickened. She dared not speak, knowing that even a whisper could betray them. The warrior's hand hovered near his bow, fingers tense, ready to draw at the first sign of danger. He had moved through countless ambushes, countless storms, but tonight the stakes were different. It was not only their physical safety at risk, but the delicate trust that had formed between them. The quiet understanding that had been built on silence, vigilance, and mutual courage. The desert seemed to tighten around them. Every sound, an insect's chirp, a stone rolling faintly in the distance. The distant cry of a bird became a signal, a potential threat. The warrior's eyes darted to the rocks above, to the scrub below, to the faint path that led into the canyon. He knew the terrain intimately, yet tonight the unknown carried more weight than the familiar. Someone or something was moving in ways that did not align with the ordinary patterns of travelers or animals. The presence was deliberate, cautious, yet unnerving. She felt the tension radiating from him and instinctively pressed closer. Careful not to startle, careful to offer a presence that was calm yet aware. The firelight danced across their faces, casting flickering shadows that made the canyon seem alive, almost conspiratorial. She had never imagined being part of a night so charged with danger, where every glance, every breath, every subtle gesture held meaning far beyond words. The warrior's voice finally broke the silence, low and steady. "They are close," he said, not as a warning, but as an acknowledgement of the threat. "We do not yet know who or what they are, but they move with intent. The desert does not forgive mistakes." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly to steady her own fear. "Do you think they know we are here?" Her words trembled slightly, but there was resolve in her tone. She was no longer simply an observer. She was part of the night, part of the tension, part of whatever was about to unfold. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his position, lowering himself behind the embers of the fire so that only his eyes, dark and calculating, remained visible. The desert demanded patience, and he knew that even the slightest reaction could give away their position. He measured the distance, the wind, the light, and the patterns of the unknown movement. Every decision had consequences, and tonight those consequences might be immediate, unforgiving, and dangerous. From the shadows, a sound rose, faint but deliberate, a shuffle of feet against sand. A low murmur, carried by the wind. The warrior's body coiled, the tension in his muscles a mirror of the desert itself, taut, watchful, ready. The maiden's breath caught in her throat, and she felt the weight of the night pressing in from all sides. The canyon seemed to shrink, the cliffs leaning closer, the shadows more numerous. And somewhere within that vast expanse, something watched them, studied them, tested them. He moved silently, a ghost among the stones. Positioning himself between the firelight and the direction of the sound, his hand gripped the bow, fingers poised, eyes fixed, every sense alive. The warrior knew that confrontation might be inevitable, yet the uncertainty of the moment, the potential for miscalculation, the fragility of trust made the anticipation almost unbearable. Every second stretched, thick with possibility, every shadow a potential threat. Every faint movement a signal of something larger waiting beyond the firelight. The maiden's pulse raced. She had expected danger, of course. But nothing had prepared her for the intensity of this waiting, for the way silence itself could become a weapon. She studied the warrior, noting the tension in his shoulders, the focus in his gaze, the subtle readiness in his posture. She realized that his life had been built on moments like this, moments where instinct, experience, and courage were tested in the raw, unyielding wilderness. And she understood with a mix of fear and awe that she was now part of one of those moments. A figure emerged from the shadows, just beyond the reach of the firelight. The warrior's body stiffened, every nerve alert. The maiden instinctively moved closer, though the fire's glow still offered a fragile sense of safety. The figure paused, and the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke and dust. It was not a coyote or any ordinary animal. This was deliberate human movement, careful, calculated, with the faint echo of intention that set every instinct on edge. "Stay close," the warrior whispered, his voice steady but carrying the weight of command. He had broken his own habit of silence only once before, in moments that demanded coordination, trust, and awareness. His words were both a warning and a comfort. Grounding her in the midst of the tense, fragile night, the figure advanced slowly, the outline becoming clearer against the cliffs. Another followed, then another, too many to count at first glance, each movement deliberate, precise, and unmistakably intentional. The canyon had become a stage, the desert an arena, and the Apache warrior and the maiden were at the center, poised between trust and danger, between courage and fear, between the known and the unknown. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could feel the tension coiling like a spring in every muscle. The firelight flickered, the wind carried whispers from distant rocks, and every sound was amplified in the quiet dawn. She realized how unprepared most would be for this, how fragile human resolve could be when confronted with both fear and wonder, danger and trust. And she recognized in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating that she had chosen to step into this. The warrior's eyes narrowed as he assessed the movement of the approaching figures. He counted them, estimated their weapons, calculated their speed, and anticipated their path. He had faced enemies before, yes, but never had he confronted a situation layered with both human danger and the delicate human trust that had formed beside him. Any wrong move could ruin not only their safety, but the fragile connection that it had begun to grow in the circle of firelight. The first figure broke from the shadows completely, revealing a face partially hidden beneath a hood. Eyes scanning the canyon with a quiet intensity, the warrior remained motionless, a living shadow among shadows, his body coiled for action. The maiden felt the fear press against her ribs, but she did not retreat. She understood now that this was more than survival. It was a test of courage, of vigilance, and of the bond that had begun to form. Another figure joined, and another, the group forming slowly, deliberately, like predators circling prey yet uncertain of what they faced. The desert had sharpened the warrior's instincts, and even he recognized that this moment carried a tension unlike any before. It was not merely about fighting or fleeing. It was about navigation of trust, of risk, of the human element that made every decision heavy with consequence. The maiden whispered, almost to herself, "Why are they coming?" Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried a note of disbelief, of awe, of the realization that danger was immediate and real. She had imagined adventure, but she had not imagined the weight of it. The way fear and anticipation could tangle together, binding body and mind into a single, focused pulse. The warrior's gaze never left the approaching figures. He assessed, he calculated, he waited. The desert had taught him patience, but even patience had limits when shadows advanced with intent and the fragile trust of the night hung in the balance. Every instinct screamed readiness. Every thought circled possibilities. Every breath was measured against the unknown. And as the figures drew closer, the canyon seemed to shrink further, the shadows coalescing, the desert itself holding its breath. The moment stretched, a knife edge of anticipation, a fragile balance of trust, courage, and danger. The Apache warrior and the maiden stood poised at the threshold of confrontation. Every heartbeat a drum, every glance a test, every motion a potential pivot between survival and peril, between fear and action, between the known and the unknown. The canyon walls seemed to close in, the light of dawn painting everything in stark contrasts. The desert whispered, the wind carried secrets, the firelight flickered, and the shadows moved with intent. The night was over, but the day had not yet begun. The climax of tension approached, and neither warrior nor maiden could predict how the encounter would unfold. They were caught in the delicate balance between danger and trust, and the canyon waited with bated breath, as though the desert itself had conspired to make this moment unforgettable. Every step, every glance, every breath was a test. The figures in the distance had not yet revealed their intentions. The warrior had not yet acted, and the maiden's courage had yet to be fully tested. The desert had brought them here, had woven them into its patterns, and now it demanded a reckoning that none could predict. The story, poised on the edge of action, teetered between fear and resolution. The suspense so thick it seemed to vibrate in the air, and in that suspended moment, the Apache warrior felt the weight of every rule he had ever followed, every choice he had made, every lesson learned in the harsh desert. The maiden felt the pull of courage and trust, the raw immediacy of life and danger. And the canyon, vast and unforgiving, waited for the inevitable collision. The approaching moment that would demand decisions, demand action, demand courage beyond the ordinary. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the canyon, washing the jagged cliffs in warm gold and soft pink. The desert, which had held its breath through the night, began to stir once more, the wind now gentle, the scrub quietly swaying. The distant cry of birds marking the slow return of life. The tension that had gripped the canyon like a living thing began to ease, though the memory of danger lingered, etched into both the warrior and the maiden as sharply as the shadows had been. The figures that had approached during the night were gone. The reason for their presence remained partially a mystery, a fleeting shadow in the fabric of the desert's vastness. The Apache warrior had assessed the threat, prepared for confrontation, and in the end, the unknown had retreated, perhaps sensing the same force he carried: patience, vigilance, and the quiet power of experience. Though relief was present, it was tempered by the recognition that the desert never truly surrendered its lessons. Every encounter left an imprint, a reminder that courage and wisdom must travel together, and that trust is a fragile but vital shield. The maiden exhaled, a deep breath she had not realized she had been holding. Her heart still raced, her muscles still carried the tension of the night, but a strange calm had settled over her. She looked at the warrior beside her, noting the way he now allowed himself a moment of rest. His body relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. She realized in that quiet morning light how much she had learned about strength, restraint, and the unspoken rules that guided a life lived in harmony with danger and responsibility. You saved me," she said softly, almost as if speaking aloud would make it less real. Her words carried gratitude, awe, and a newfound respect for the man whose presence had been both shield and guide through the long night. She did not speak of fear or weakness, or mistakes, only of acknowledgement, of the human connection that had formed quietly in the circle of firelight. Amid shadows and danger, the warrior's gaze softened, a rare shift that spoke more than words ever could. "I did what was necessary," he replied, his voice steady but carrying warmth beneath its calm surface. "And you showed courage. That matters more than most realize." His eyes met hers fully for the first time in hours, not just seeing her as a traveler in the desert, but as someone who had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown with a willingness to trust, to act, and to endure. For a long moment, silence held them. It was no longer tense or fraught with anticipation. It was quiet in the way that only the desert at dawn could be quiet, a silence that felt like understanding. The warrior rose slowly, stretching, the movement deliberate and measured. The maiden followed, moving beside him, their steps echoing lightly against the stones of the canyon floor. It was a moment of transition, a passage from the night of suspense and danger into the clarity of day. Yet it felt weighted with significance. They walked together toward the edge of the canyon. The rising sun revealing the landscape in full, cliffs etched with the marks of wind and time, the desert floor, a mosaic of sand, stone, and hardy plants that thrived against the odds. The warrior pointed out the paths he knew well, explaining the patterns of water and shelter, the signs of animals and travelers, and the ways to read the land that had sustained his people for generations. The maiden listened, fascinated not only by the practical lessons, but by the deeper understanding that the desert required patience, respect, and humility. As they moved, he shared fragments of his past, the stories of his youth, the lessons learned from elders, the battles fought quietly to preserve both life and honor. The maiden absorbed these tales, seeing in them the same principles she had glimpsed during the night: restraint, vigilance, courage, and the careful navigation of trust. She realized that the warrior's life had been shaped by choices, by an understanding that every action carried consequence, and by the wisdom to recognize that power without control was meaningless. The canyon gradually opened to a broader valley, the sunlight now spilling freely across sand and stone. A gentle breeze lifted her hair, carrying the scent of sage and distant flowers, and the weight of the night's suspense began to fade. Yet the lessons remained. She understood that courage was not simply acting without fear, but acting with awareness, with respect for the unknown, and with the willingness to place trust in another person without guarantee. The warrior's presence had been both challenge and guide, and she carried the understanding that such moments, rare, intense, and transformative, could shape a life. They paused at a rocky outcropping that overlooked the valley below. The warrior looked down at the path they had traveled, tracing the shadows of the night in his memory, recalling the flickering firelight, the movements in the dark, and the choices that had defined the hours of danger. He had faced countless perils in his life, yet this night had tested not just his skills, but his capacity for trust, for patience, and for understanding the human element beyond survival. The maiden spoke again, her voice steady now, though it carried the gravity of reflection. "I thought I came here to find adventure," she said, "but I found more. I found courage I didn't know I had, and a trust I didn't know I could offer. And I learned that the desert teaches more than survival." He nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that her words captured the essence of the night. "The desert teaches balance," he said. "It teaches respect for life, for danger, for trust, and for choices. You learned quickly. That will serve you well wherever your path leads." The sun climbed higher, warming their faces and the rocks beneath their feet. The canyon seemed to breathe, releasing the tension that had filled the night, and the valley below glimmered with the promise of a day unburdened by immediate threat. Yet both knew that life in the deserts, or life in any challenging place, was never without risk. The night's events would remain with them, a memory and a guide, shaping how they approached the unknown, how they trusted others, and how they valued courage in its many forms. The warrior finally lowered his gaze to the maiden, a subtle shift that spoke of respect, recognition, and shared experience. "You are stronger than you realize," he said simply. "Remember that. And remember that trust is a force as powerful as any weapon, as protective as any shield." She smiled softly, a mixture of relief and gratitude, understanding fully the weight of what he said. Trust, courage, patience, these were not abstract ideals but tools, guiding principles that had carried them through a night of uncertainty and danger. She carried the knowledge that she had faced fear, embraced challenge, and emerged with a sense of understanding and strength that would remain with her long after the desert faded from sight. They began to make their way back toward the edge of the canyon, retracing the path that had brought them through shadow and firelight, through risk and human connection. Each step was measured, careful, reflective, as if the desert itself had imparted a rhythm of thought, patience, and awareness that would guide them beyond the valley. The warrior spoke occasionally, offering practical advice, recounting lessons from the land, and reminding her that even in calm, One must remain vigilant not in fear, but in respect for life and its unpredictability. As they reached the canyon rim, the full expanse of the desert stretched out before them, vast, open, and alive. The maiden paused, taking in the view, the cliffs, the valleys, the distant rivers shimmering in the sunlight, and felt a profound sense of completion and beginning at once. The night had tested her, shaped her, and shown her the depths of courage and trust she carried within. The warrior stood beside her, a quiet figure of strength and wisdom, his presence a reminder that the human spirit could navigate both danger and connection with care and honor. Finally, they turned together, beginning the descent from the canyon, each step echoing in the still morning. The desert, now calm and bathed in sunlight, seemed to smile upon them, a witness to the night's trials and to the human courage that had endured. The warrior and the maiden walked in quiet companionship, each carrying lessons from the other, each strengthened by the trust, courage, and understanding that had been forged in the hours of shadow, firelight, and suspense. And as they disappeared down the winding path into the valley below, the canyon held its quiet, eternal presence, a testament to the challenges faced and the lessons learned. The night was over, but its lessons remained a story of courage, trust, patience, and human connection. A story that would linger in memory long after the desert had claimed its silence once more.